January 27, 1945. Iwo Jima. The Pacific dawn came slowly that morning, reluctant, as if the sun itself hesitated to witness what the day would bring. On the volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima, Japanese Lieutenant Colonel Baron Takichi Nishi stood in the entrance of his underground command post, a cup of bitter tea cooling in his hands. The liquid trembled with each distant rumble, not thunder, but something far more ominous rolling across the gray waters from the east. He had heard this sound before, weeks ago, when the first American bombers came. But this morning, the rhythm was different, deeper, unending. The sound of an empire's industrial heart beating against the shores of Japan itself. 3 years earlier, in the officers' clubs of Tokyo and Osaka, men like Nishi had raised glasses of sake to toast Japan's inevitable victory. They spoke with certainty about American weakness, about a nation too soft, too divided, too dependent on luxury to sustain a real war. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been designed not merely to cripple the American Pacific Fleet, but to break American will before it could even form. Japanese military theorists had calculated that the United States, despite its industrial capacity, lacked the spiritual strength to endure a prolonged conflict across an ocean. They pointed to American love of comfort, to labor disputes in factories, to isolationist sentiment in Congress. How could such a people, they reasoned, stand against the disciplined warriors of the rising sun? Among the weapons they dismissed most thoroughly was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Japanese intelligence officers had obtained detailed specifications of the aircraft as early as 1938, when the bomber first entered service. They noted its size, its defensive armament, its operational ceiling. In technical briefings, they acknowledged its range and payload capacity. But in the quiet confidence of strategic planning rooms, they calculated that such large, expensive aircraft could never be produced in sufficient numbers to matter. The B-17 required thousands of hours to build, demanded rare materials, needed highly trained crews. Japan's own heavy bomber programs had been scaled back precisely because such aircraft were deemed economically unsustainable for mass production. Surely the Americans, for all their wealth, would face the same constraints. A handful of flying fortresses might raid the periphery of Japan's expanding empire, but they could never threaten the home islands themselves. The distances were too vast, the logistics too complex, the costs too prohibitive. Captain Homare Fujita, a fighter pilot who had flown against early B-17 formations over New Guinea in 1942, remembered writing home to his wife about the American bombers. "We encountered 3 of their heavy aircraft today," his letter read, preserved now in the Japanese military archives. "They are indeed formidable machines, well armed and able to absorb damage. But they are too few. We can afford to lose 3 fighters to bring down 1 such bomber, because they cannot afford to build enough to make a difference. Their economy, for all its size, cannot sustain this waste of resources. By the time they build 100, we will have built 1,000 fighters to meet them." The mathematics seemed sound. The logic appeared unassailable. And yet, on that January morning in 1945, as Baron Nishi stood listening to the thunder from the east, he knew with terrible certainty that every calculation had been catastrophically wrong. The B-17 Flying Fortress had indeed been expensive to produce. Each airframe required 140,000 separate parts, 350,000 rivets, and approximately 47,000 man-hours of labor. The aircraft consumed aluminum, rubber, and high-grade steel in quantities that would have bankrupted smaller nations. A single bomber cost the American taxpayer roughly $200,000 in 1943 currency, the equivalent of 400 modern homes or 100 light tanks. By every measure of traditional military economics, the Flying Fortress should have been a luxury weapon, produced in limited numbers for strategic targets. But American industrial capacity in World War II did not follow traditional economics. It followed a different logic entirely, one that Japanese planners had failed to comprehend. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced 12,731 B-17 bombers. Not dozens, not hundreds, nearly 13,000 of the bombers. Massive aircraft, rolling off assembly lines that worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in shifts that never stopped. The Boeing plant in Seattle became a cathedral of rivets and wing sections, where women who had never touched industrial tools before the war now built bombers with a precision that matched or exceeded the finest craftsmen. The Douglas plant in Long Beach converted automobile production lines into bomber assembly chains. Vega Aircraft in Burbank employed 41,000 workers producing B-17 components in a facility that had not existed before 1941. The production numbers told a story that Japanese intelligence officers, even when they saw the figures in captured documents, refused to believe. In 1942, Boeing delivered 184 B-17s per month. By 1943, that number had risen to 362 per month. At peak production in 1944, American plants completed one B-17 every 63 minutes. The Seattle plant alone employed 45,000 workers on the bomber program, operating in 3 continuous shifts that transformed raw aluminum into combat-ready aircraft with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. The United States was not merely building flying fortresses. It was building them faster than Japan could train pilots to intercept them, faster than Japanese industry could produce fighters to oppose them, faster than the mathematical models of sustainable warfare suggested was even possible. Sergeant Yoshio Takahashi, an anti-aircraft gunner stationed near Osaka, kept a personal diary throughout 1944 that captured the gradual Japanese recognition of this terrible truth. His early entries were confident, even cheerful. In March, he wrote, "3 B-29s appeared over the city today. We drove them off with heavy fire. One was seen trailing smoke. The Americans cannot sustain such losses." By June, his tone had shifted. 17 heavy bombers today. Our guns damaged several, but all returned to their bases. The numbers are greater than we were told to expect. In September, his handwriting had become smaller, tighter, as if conserving paper for a long war. 53 bombers counted. The sky is dark with them. How many factories do they possess? How many crews? Our commanders say they are at the limit of their capacity, but the numbers only grow. The B-29 Superfortress, which Takahashi observed, was an even more advanced aircraft than the B-17, purpose-built for the Pacific Theater, with the range to strike Japan from bases in the Mariana Islands. But the strategic bombing campaign that devastated Japanese cities in 1944 and 1945 had been made possible by the earlier B-17, which had proven the concept, refined the tactics, and trained the crews in the European theater. American Bomber Command over Germany had been a school, a brutal and costly school where young pilots learned to fly in formation, where navigators mastered the art of finding targets through cloud cover, where gunners developed the split-second coordination necessary to defend a formation against determined fighter attack. Every mission over Berlin, every raid on Hamburg or Dresden had been preparation for the final act, the reduction of Japanese industry to rubble and ash. The Japanese High Command watched the bombing of Germany with the attention of men studying a preview of their own fate. They read the intelligence reports from Europe, where German cities burned despite the Luftwaffe's desperate defense. They noted the American tactics, daylight precision bombing in massive formations, relying on overlapping fields of defensive fire rather than speed or altitude alone. They observed that the Americans accepted horrific casualties in the early raids. 20% losses were common in 1943, but kept coming, their formations growing larger with each month, their tactics improving through bitter experience. German fighter pilots had claimed thousands of American bombers destroyed. German anti-aircraft guns had turned the sky over the Ruhr into a maelstrom of fire. And yet, by late 1944, the Americans were flying missions of over 1,000 bombers at a time, obliterating German industrial capacity through sheer mass and persistence. The lesson was clear, and it was terrifying. American industry could absorb losses that would cripple any other nation and emerge stronger. The United States did not merely replace destroyed bombers, it increased production. When crew losses mounted, American training programs expanded, graduating more pilots, More bombardiers, more navigators, more gunners than the combat units could immediately absorb. The pipeline of men and machines seemed infinite, fed by an economic engine that Japanese strategists had fundamentally misunderstood. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a staff officer in the Japanese Imperial Headquarters, wrote in his classified assessment of January 1945, "We calculated American will, but we failed to calculate American capacity. We assumed they would fight as we would fight, with the forces they possessed at the beginning, gradually depleted by attrition. We did not imagine they would fight with forces that grew stronger with each month of war. We thought we were battling the American military of December 1941. We were wrong. We are now battling the American economy itself, and that is an enemy we cannot defeat with courage alone." The first major B-17 raid against Japanese-held territory came on December 7, 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor. 18 flying fortresses of the 5th Bombardment Group struck Japanese installations in Rabaul, New Britain. The symbolism of the date was not lost on the crews, who had painted messages on their bombs: "Return to Sender" and "Merry Christmas, Tojo." The raid inflicted modest physical damage but enormous psychological impact. Japanese commanders in Rabaul, who had grown accustomed to air superiority since the opening days of the war, suddenly faced an adversary who could strike from altitudes their fighters struggled to reach, with defensive firepower that made interception costly and dangerous. The tactics evolved throughout 1943 and 1944. In the European theater, American bomber crews developed the combat box formation, a three-dimensional arrangement of aircraft that maximized defensive gun coverage while maintaining tight formation for accurate bombing. Each B-17 carried 13 50-caliber machine guns manned by 6 gunners, creating an overlapping field of fire that could shred attacking fighters. When 30 or 40 fortresses flew in formation, the combined firepower exceeded that of a naval destroyer, all concentrated in a cubic mile of sky. Luftwaffe pilots learned to respect this firepower at terrible cost. German fighter losses over Germany in 1943 exceeded 50% among experienced pilots, casualties that could not be replaced. These same tactics transferred to the Pacific, where Japanese fighters faced the same mathematical problem their German counterparts had confronted: how to attack a formation that could put up 500 guns worth of defensive fire. Japanese aircraft of 1944, the Ki-84 Frank, the Ki-100, the various models of Zero, were magnificent dogfighters, nimble and deadly in individual combat. But they had not been designed to assault massed bomber formations. Their light armament, adequate for attacking single bombers or fighters, proved insufficient against the layered defenses of a combat box. Their light construction, which gave them extraordinary maneuverability, meant that a single burst from a 50-caliber gun could be catastrophic. Japanese pilots adapted, developing head-on attacks that minimized exposure time, experimenting with air-to-air bombing, eventually resorting to kamikaze tactics when conventional interception proved too costly. But adaptation could not overcome the fundamental arithmetic. The Americans were producing bombers, training crews, and accumulating force at a rate that exceeded Japanese capacity to resist. By November 1944, the first B-29 superfortresses were operating from bases in the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These bases, captured at horrific cost in summer fighting, placed Tokyo within range of American heavy bombers for the first time. The initial raids were high-altitude precision strikes, targeting aircraft factories and military installations. Results were mixed. Japan's weather was often poor, and high-altitude winds scattered bomb patterns. But the American command learned, just as it had learned over Germany. If precision bombing was difficult, area bombing was not. If high altitude reduced accuracy, lower altitude would improve it, regardless of increased risk. The terrible logic of total war was asserting itself, and Japanese cities, built largely of wood and paper, were uniquely vulnerable to incendiary attack. The fire raids began in March 1945. On the night of March 9-10, 334 B-29s struck Tokyo with incendiary bombs,
creating a firestorm that consumed 16 square miles of the city and killed an estimated 100,000 civilians in a single night. It was the deadliest air raid in human history, exceeding
even the atomic bombings that would come later. The heat was so intense that water in the canals boiled. Glass melted in windows. People caught in the open were incinerated so completely that they left no remains. Only shadows burned into pavement. Survivors spoke of seeing flames that seemed alive, that pursued fleeing crowds with purposeful malevolence, that consumed oxygen so rapidly that people suffocated before the fire could reach them. The B-17 was not used in these Pacific raids. By 1945, the longer-range B-29 had become the primary strategic bomber against Japan. But the path to Tokyo had been paved by the Flying Fortress, which had proven the doctrine, developed the tactics, and broken the myth of the impregnable homeland. The smoke that rose over Tokyo in March 1945 had been years in the making, born in the factories of Seattle and Long Beach, refined in the terrible skies over Germany, and delivered with the mechanical precision of an industrial civilization fully mobilized for war. In his underground bunker on Iwo Jima, Baron Nishi understood all of this, though he could not have articulated it in such terms. He understood it in the rumble that shook dust from the tunnel ceiling, in the continuous procession of American aircraft that passed overhead on their way to bomb the home islands, in the simple arithmetic that told him reinforcements would never come because there were no more reinforcements to send. The American bombers overhead were not just weapons. They were proof of a productive capacity so vast that it defied the imagination of men who had grown up in a Japan where resources were scarce and every gun, every bullet, every aircraft was precious. The Japanese military had prepared its soldiers to face death with courage, and this they did with a dedication that awed even their enemies. But no amount of courage could compensate for the industrial imbalance that defined the Pacific War. For every Japanese factory worker, America had 10. For every ton of steel Japan produced, America produced 20. For every aircraft that rolled out of a Japanese factory, America produced 21. Plant, American factories produced 16. The United States in 1944 manufactured 96,318 aircraft of all types, while Japan produced 28,180. In the crucial category of heavy bombers, the aircraft that could strike deep into enemy territory and devastate industrial capacity, the disparity was even more stark. Japan produced 0 heavy bombers in 1944, having abandoned such programs as economically unfeasible. America produced 16,331. These were not merely numbers in a ledger, they translated directly into the air war that consumed Japan in the final year of the conflict. By summer 1945, American bombers were running short of targets. 66 major Japanese cities had been subjected to area bombing, their industrial districts reduced to ash and twisted metal. The civilian death toll exceeded 500,000, with millions more left homeless. Japanese war production, already strained by the submarine blockade that choked off raw material imports, collapsed. Aircraft production fell by half. Ammunition became scarce. Fuel allocations for training were cut to near zero, so that new pilots went into combat with fewer than 50 hours of flight time, hopelessly outmatched by American aviators who had 200 hours of training before they ever saw combat. The title that mocked American flying fortresses, the dismissive confidence that such expensive machines could never appear in meaningful numbers, haunted the Japanese military leadership in their final deliberations. In the Supreme War Council meetings of August 1945, as the leadership debated whether to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration or continue fighting to the point of national extinction, the specter of American air power loomed over every calculation. Even if Japan could somehow mobilize enough civilians with bamboo spears to contest an American invasion of the home islands, even if every man, woman, and child fought to the death, what would it matter when American bombers could simply burn every city to the ground from altitudes Japanese forces could not reach? The samurai code taught that death in battle was honorable, but what honor existed in dying beneath incendiary bombs while America lost not a single soldier? The psychological impact of bombing campaign cannot be separated from its physical effects.
Japanese civilians in the last months of the war lived in a state of constant terror, never knowing when the air raid sirens would sound, never certain that their neighborhood would survive the night. The social fabric began to fray. Government credibility, built on promises of eventual victory, evaporated in the smoke of burning cities. Workers in war factories, who had endured long hours and meager rations in the belief that their sacrifice mattered, began to question whether any amount of production could match the seemingly infinite resources of the enemy. Soldiers at the front, still fighting with discipline and courage, received letters from home describing devastation beyond imagination, and wondered what they were defending if the homeland itself was being methodically erased. The symbol that haunted Japanese consciousness in those final months was not a single weapon or image, but a sound. The drone of high-altitude engines, distant and untouchable. That sound became the background noise of Japanese life in 1945, a constant reminder of powerlessness. It woke people from shallow sleep in the hour before dawn. It interrupted school children in their lessons, sending them scrambling for shelters. It accompanied the elderly as they tended small gardens, growing vegetables to supplement disappearing rations. The sound was everywhere and nowhere, coming from an altitude where the aircraft themselves were barely visible, tiny glints of aluminum in the stratosphere. American bombers, whether B-17s or B-29s, became in the Japanese imagination something more than military equipment. They became the manifestation of an enemy whose resources were so vast, whose productive capacity was so overwhelming, that resistance itself seemed an act of futility. American aircrew, for their part, rarely understood the psychological weight they carried. For them, a mission over Japan was a job, dangerous and exhausting, but ultimately just another point on the route toward rotation home. They sat in their cramped positions for 8 or 10 or 12 hours, breathing oxygen through masks, monitoring instruments, watching for fighters, dropping bombs on coordinates provided by navigation, and then flying home to bases,
where hot food and showers waited. Some felt guilt about the civilian casualties their bombs inflicted. Many more felt only relief at having survived another mission. They counted their missions toward the magic number that would send them home, and they did not think much about what it meant to the people below that American industry could send out 1,000 bombers in a day, and do it again the next day and the day after that, indefinitely, until every target in Japan was obliterated. But this was precisely the horror of it from the Japanese perspective. The Americans could sustain this level of destruction without apparent effort or strain. There was no moment when the raids stopped for lack of aircraft or bombs or fuel. There was no pause while factories retooled or crews rested. The bombers came as regularly as the seasons and in ever-increasing numbers. By July 1945, American commanders were ordering raids on cities of less than 100,000 people, having exhausted larger targets. In some cases, the Americans dropped leaflets warning civilians to evacuate before the attack, a propaganda gesture that highlighted the attackers' complete air superiority. We can tell you we are coming, and there is nothing you can do to stop us. The final weeks of the war saw perhaps the most bizarre juxtaposition of all. American bombers flying over Japan, encountering minimal resistance, while on the ground, Japanese forces prepared for the invasion that never came. Schoolgirls practiced fighting with sharpened bamboo poles. Elderly men joined volunteer defense units armed with 19th century rifles. Engineers dug caves in coastal hillsides where civilians could make last stands. It was a vision of national suicide, an entire people preparing to die fighting because surrender was considered dishonor worse than death. And above them, daily, the bombers passed, untouched and untouchable, dropping leaflets now instead of bombs, leaflets that urged surrender, that promised fair treatment, that warned of atomic weapons to come. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August, they were delivered by B-29 superfortresses, but they represented the culmination of what? The B-17 had begun. The doctrine of strategic bombing, the belief that air power alone could break an enemy's will to resist by destroying the economic and industrial capacity that sustained the war effort. The atomic bombs were more efficient than conventional incendiaries, but the principle was identical. Apply overwhelming force from an altitude the enemy cannot reach, against targets the enemy cannot adequately defend, until continued resistance becomes strategically impossible. The Japanese surrender on August 15, 1945, was presented to the public as the emperor's decision to bear the unbearable and accept the Potsdam terms. But in the private deliberations of the Supreme War Council, the military leaders who had once mocked Americans' soft dependence on machines faced a simple truth. They had been defeated not by superior courage or better strategy, but by superior production. The Americans had built more ships, more tanks, more aircraft, more of everything than Japan could possibly match. And they had done so while also fighting a major war in Europe, supporting British and Soviet forces with massive aid programs, and maintaining a civilian standard of living that remained, even in wartime, far above Japan's. The mocking question from 1941, how could a nation of luxury-loving individualists possibly sustain a total war, had been answered with brutal clarity. They sustained it by building 12,731 B-17 flying fortresses, and then building 3,900 B-29 superfortresses to replace them, and doing it in the span of 4 years while also producing 300,000 aircraft of other types, 88,000 tanks, 2,700 ships, and equipping the largest ground army in American history. Baron Nishi did not live to see the surrender. He died on Iwo Jima in March 1945, in the network of tunnels where Japanese forces held out for 36 days against overwhelming American firepower. His last recorded message, sent to headquarters on March 17th, read simply, "We continue to resist." There was no mention of victory, no promise of reversing the tide, just resistance, because that was all that remained. The Americans overhead, on their way to bomb Tokyo, paid no attention to the battle. Below. Iwo Jima was valuable as an emergency landing strip for damaged bombers returning from Japan, and for that purpose it needed to be captured. But the island itself was merely a step in the larger campaign. The bombers continued their daily missions throughout the battle, and they continued after the island fell. And they would have continued indefinitely, reducing Japan to ashes one city at a time, if the atomic bombs and Soviet declaration of war had not finally broken the stalemate in the Supreme War Council. Homare Fujita, the fighter pilot who had written so confidently to his wife in 1942, also did not survive. He was killed in October 1944, ramming his damage Zero into a B-29 over Formosa after his ammunition ran out. His final letter home, written the night before his death, strikes a different tone than his earlier correspondence. "I no longer think about victory or defeat. I think only about doing my duty and dying well. The Americans have more aircraft than we have bullets. This is a fact, not defeatism. But we are not fighting for victory anymore. We are fighting for time, so that perhaps some honorable peace can be negotiated. If my death buys one more day for such negotiations, it will not have been wasted." No peace was negotiated. Fujita's sacrifice, like thousands of others, bought nothing but a few more months of destruction. In the archives of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, compiled in the months after the war, Japanese military officers and government officials were interviewed extensively about the impact of the bombing campaign. Their responses were remarkably consistent. When asked what single factor most contributed to Japan's defeat, they did not cite the atomic bombs, or the Soviet entry into the war, or the destruction of the Navy, or the submarine blockade, though all of these were mentioned. The most common answer was simply American industrial production. And when pressed to identify the symbol of that production, many pointed to the heavy bombers that had filled the sky in the war's final year. One former colonel, whose name is redacted in the documents, stated, "We knew abstractly that America was a wealthy nation, but we assumed wealth could not be mobilized quickly for war. We were wrong. The speed with which they transformed peaceful industries into war production exceeded anything in military history. By the time we understood what we were facing, it was already too late. The flying fortresses we dismissed in 1941 were bombing our cities by 1944,
in numbers we could not have imagined. That was when I knew we had lost. The B-17 itself in the Pacific theater was largely replaced by the B-29 for the final assault on Japan, but its legacy was inescapable. Every tactical doctrine, every formation strategy, every navigational technique used by the B-29 crews had been developed and refined by B-17 units over Europe. The maintenance procedures, the crew training programs, the logistics of supporting long-range heavy bomber operations, all of this institutional knowledge transferred directly from the European theater to the Pacific. The men who planned the Tokyo raids had cut their teeth planning raids over Berlin. The navigators who found their targets through clouds over Japan had learned their craft finding targets through clouds over Germany. The entire apparatus of strategic bombing that devastated Japan in 1945 was built on the foundation of the Flying Fortress, which had proven that such bombing was possible, sustainable, and ultimately decisive. There is a photograph taken in August 1945 on Tinian Harland that captures something essential about this story. It shows a line of B-29 superfortresses on a runway, extending to the horizon, each aircraft being loaded with bombs for the night's raid on Japan. The photograph was taken from an elevated position, perhaps a control tower, and the angle emphasizes the seemingly endless procession of bombers. There are at least 50 visible in the frame, and the line continues beyond what the camera can capture. Ground crews swarm around each aircraft, loading bombs, filling fuel tanks, checking systems. The image is matter-of-fact, almost industrial in its composition. There is nothing dramatic or heroic about it.
It simply documents a day's work preparing for a night's mission. But this very mundanity is what makes the photograph devastating. This is not a special raid, not a maximum effort, not a desperate gamble. This is routine. This is what American industrial capacity looked like in 1945. A horizon filled with heavy bombers, each costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, each carrying tons of explosives, each crewed by 10 highly trained men, and there are hundreds more at other bases. And tomorrow, there will be another mission with another line of bombers, and the day after that, another, indefinitely, until the enemy surrenders or ceases to exist. This is what Japanese officers in 1941 could not imagine. What their calculations told them was economically impossible, what their military theories insisted no nation could sustain. The men who mocked American flying fortresses made a fundamental error in strategic assessment. They correctly identified that the B-17 was expensive and difficult to produce. They correctly calculated that traditional military economics would limit production to modest numbers. Their error was in assuming that America would fight a traditional war, bounded by traditional economic constraints. But the United States in World War II was not fighting a traditional war. It was fighting an industrial war, where the outcome would be determined not primarily by courage or tactics or battlefield skill, but by productive capacity. And in this type of war, America's greatest advantages, its vast natural resources, its highly developed industrial base, its educated workforce, its culture of innovation and efficiency, all came into play. The Boeing assembly lines in Seattle became the front line of this industrial war. The women riveting aluminum sheeting, the men installing electrical systems, the engineers solving production bottlenecks. These were the soldiers who defeated Japan as surely as any Marine on a Pacific island. Every B-17 that rolled out of the factory was a strategic defeat for Japan, a widening of the gap between American capacity and Japanese capability. By 1944, American factories were producing heavy bombers at a rate that exceeded Japan's entire aircraft production. Of all types. This was not merely a quantitative difference, it was a qualitative transformation in the nature of warfare itself. The post-war years would see intense debate about the morality and effectiveness of strategic bombing. Critics would point out that many raids inflicted horrific civilian casualties with questionable military benefit. Defenders would argue that strategic bombing shortened the war and ultimately saved lives by making invasion unnecessary. These debates continue, and they are important, but they exist in a different dimension from the pure strategic fact.
The Americans possessed the industrial capacity to conduct strategic bombing on a massive scale, and the Japanese did not possess the capacity to prevent it. In a total war between industrial societies, this asymmetry was ultimately decisive. 75 years after the last B-17 bombing mission, the aircraft has become a museum piece, a symbol of American heroism and the greatest generation. Restored flying fortresses appear at air shows, where crowds marvel at their size and complexity. Veterans, those few who remain, speak at schools about their missions over Europe. The B-17 has been absorbed into the mythology of the Good War, the war where American righteousness and American industrial power combined to defeat genuine evil. This mythology is not entirely false, but it is incomplete. It tends to emphasize the heroism of individual crews while overlooking the larger story, that the B-17 was a weapon of industrial warfare, designed not for individual heroism but for mass production, and that its true impact came not from any single dramatic raid but from the cumulative weight of 13,000 aircraft grinding down enemy capacity until resistance became pointless. For the Japanese officers who dismissed the flying fortress in 1941, there was no dramatic moment of realization, no single day when they understood their error. Recognition came gradually, mission by mission, raid by raid, as the numbers became undeniable and the logic of industrial war asserted itself. Some, like Baron Nishi, died still fighting, maintaining discipline and courage even after hope was gone. Others, like the anonymous colonel in the strategic bombing survey, survived to articulate what defeat meant, that they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern war, and that understanding came too late to matter. In the end, the story of the B-17 over Japan is not really a story about aircraft at all. It is a story about miscalculation, about the gap between assumption and reality, about what happens when military strategy collides with industrial capacity. The Japanese military made many errors in the Pacific War, but perhaps the most fundamental was underestimating not American courage or skill, but American production. They looked at the B-17 Flying Fortress and saw an expensive luxury, a weapon that would appear in small numbers and remain strategically marginal. They did not see the assembly lines behind it, the training program supporting it, the economic system sustaining it. They did not imagine 700 such bombers over Tokyo, or 70,000 workers building them in Seattle, or a nation that could produce such weapons while simultaneously fighting another major war on the far side of the planet. This failure of imagination, more than any battlefield defeat, sealed Japan's fate. The officers who mocked the Flying Fortress learned their error, but they learned it too late, looking up at a sky dark with the very aircraft they had dismissed, the drone of engines announcing the price of miscalculation. And that sound, that persistent drone, became the sound of industrial modernity itself, the rhythm of an empire learning what total war truly meant in an age when production was power, and America's factories had become arsenals of democracy that Japan could never match, never counter, never escape.